each year, we have organized a series of briefings, usually around the time of the anniversary of the earthquake. This time we're a little off of that anniversary, partly for logistical reasons, but I think also because we're kind of moving into a broader spectrum of issues beyond just, the reconstruction effort following the earthquake. It's been over 5 years now, and we're dealing with a lot of issues that have endured in Haiti really for years and years. And so those are some of the things we're going to be discussing today. And this particular briefing is on Haiti's democracy and political situation. It's going to be focused quite a bit on the elections, I imagine, given our panel. And I will introduce them before each of their interventions. Also a quick introduction of myself and my organization. So I'm Alex Main. I'm a policy analyst at the Center for Economic and Policy Research. And the name doesn't suggest that we work on Haiti, but we have done a lot of work on Haiti, particularly since the earthquake. We do a lot around aid accountability. My colleague Jake Johnston is the lead author on our Haiti blog, Haiti Relief and Reconstruction Watch blog, that follows the aid effort, but also a lot of other issues, including the political developments in Haiti. And we've also, over the years, paid a lot of attention to the political situation, and particularly elections. And I just want to remind people, for those that weren't around or may not remember, since it's now 5 years ago, but shortly after the earthquake, there were a lot of people saying it's very important to have good, free, fair, transparent, and inclusive elections following this earthquake, because Haiti, at this critical juncture, desperately needs strong institutions, strong popular mandate in order to carry out this huge reconstruction effort efficiently. So that was the message that was coming from a lot of the international community. And what transpired was quite disappointing. Everyone agreed that the worst thing would be having questionable elections with low participation, and that's exactly what happened. So the international community pushed for elections to take place really as soon as possible, and they took place in a very difficult context, where you had still 1.5 million Haitians in camps, and many more scattered around the country, making it difficult, obviously, for them to go to their usual voting centers. And you had an additional aggravating factor that began in October of 2010, which was a cholera epidemic. And at the time that this started, what authorities were telling the population was avoid congregating. So try avoiding to congregate in the middle of an election, not the easiest thing. So the first round of these elections, there was a very small turnout, less than 26%. There were a lot of irregularities, there were a lot of incidents. We're going to hear more about this on the panel. And initially, nearly all of the presidential candidates on the day of the elections called for the cancellation of the elections and called for them to take place again. And the first round results that came out initially had... Yeah, that's what I thought. That's okay. So the first round of the elections, you had two leading contenders, Milan Manigat for the presidency, Milan Manigat and Jules Célestin. And there was a bit of an uproar. You had the supporters of Michel Martelly, who came in third place in these elections, that took to the streets. And then you also had, concurrently, the U.S. Embassy putting out statements about possible fraud, and more pressure being put on the CEP to change the results. And we're going to hear more about that from one of our panelists. But ultimately, that's what happened. Under a huge amount of pressure, the results were changed, but it was very evident that the international community had intervened heavily and forced the change of results. And that had a huge impact on how these elections were perceived by the population. So, and it's something that we've worked a lot on at CEPR. There's actually a paper of ours that's just outside that looks at the Organization of American States expert commission, which did an investigation recommending a change in the results, and we show how that recommendation was actually a very arbitrary one and politically motivated. So fast forward to today, we have a situation where the elections are more than 3 years delayed. You've had a lot of protests recently. You had the Prime Minister last year who was forced to resign. And you now have a parliament that can no longer function because the terms have ran out, and so they don't have a quorum in order to function, and you have the government ruling by decree. So it seems at the same time that elections may finally be on track. And so I think kind of the global questions I want to ask the panelists here, and I think they can give us some very insightful answers to them, is will the next elections, will they be the elections that Haiti needs and deserves? And what needs to happen for Haiti to have the elections it needs and deserves? And finally, what else can the international community do or shouldn't do to help strengthen Haiti's democracy and government? So, the two questions. Okay, I'm going to repeat the questions for Jeannette. What needs to happen for Haiti to have the elections that it needs and deserves? And what else can the international community do or shouldn't do to help strengthen Haiti's democracy and government? So first, today we're going to be hearing from Ginette Cherubin, who is an architect and poet, among many other things, and a very active feminist in Haiti, based in Port-au-Prince. She was the Minister of Women's Affairs from 1996 to 1997. And she was a member of 2 of Haiti's Provisional Electoral Councils between 2007 and 2011. She wrote her book about the experience at the CEP, the Provisional Electoral Council. It's this one. It's called Le Ventre pourri de la bête, which means the rotten belly of the beast. So that gives you an idea of the tenor of her book. And it was just recently published in 2013 by the State University of Haiti. So I think Jeannette is probably going to tell us about her experience in some short words and the lessons from that experience that she had as a member of Haiti's electoral authority. So, can everyone hear Jeannette? I'm the only one with the mic. So.
Yes. Okay. Bonjour.
Good morning.
Je tiens à saluer toute l'assistance ici présente.
I greet everyone here.
Et je remercie le HAUG de m'avoir invité à participer à ce panel. Mes remerciements s'adressent d'abord à Alexandre Main,
And I would especially like to thank Alexander Main.
que j'ai rencontré sur l'Internet
We met one another on the internet
au moment du scandale
at the time of the scandal,
des enquêteurs de l'OEA.
for the when the investigation was being done on the state
By the OAS.
Qui, loin de respecter le mandat qui leur avait été attribué,
It was very far from respecting the mandate that they had been given.
ils ont cuisiné les résultats des élections ici.
They cooked the results that came out of the Haitian elections.
Et c'est à ce moment que mes échanges ont commencé avec Alex.
And that's when my exchanges with Alex started.
Pour répondre aux questions d'Alex,
In answer to the question that Alex asked,
il faut quand même se baser sur certaines expériences vécues en Haïti.
let's look at the base in the experience of people in Haiti,
Et notamment dans le cadre des dernières élections.
especially within the experience of the last election.
Alors, je veux préciser que j'ai été désignée comme membre du CEP, qui est le Conseil électoral provisoire, par des associations de femmes.
I must be clear about this, that I was put into this CEP, the Election Commission, by the Women's Associations of Haiti.
La Constitution haïtienne prévoyait un seul conseil électoral provisoire après 1996, après le départ de Duvalier.
After Duvalier left, there was one provisional council for the elections.
There was, so after Duvalier left, the Constitution of Haiti only planned for one provisional electoral council.
Et la Constitution qui a été votée en 1997,
That was
non
the
pas la Constitution de Duvalier.
That was according to the Constitution that was voted in 87.
Mais jusqu'à maintenant, ça fait comme une trentaine d'années après, on est toujours au Conseil électoral provisoire.
But even until this day, we are still in the situation of having a provisional electoral council.
Et à chaque fois, il faut un consensus entre l'exécutif et les partis politiques
And every time we have to find a consensus between the executive and the political parties
pour trouver une formule de mise en place du CEP.
so that we can have the right formula to put into place the CEP, the Provisional Electoral Council.
On reviendra dessus après, et tout ceci montre déjà les causes d'une instabilité dans l'institution.
But those kind of things will help you to understand the reasons for the instability of this situation.
Et quand je suis arrivée au CEP, le consensus était que plusieurs associations, les partis politiques et d'autres secteurs de la société désignent des membres.
When I came into the situation, there was a consensus that the political parties and the others were each going to designate their members.
Et c'est ainsi que j'ai été désignée par les associations de femmes.
And that's why I came to be designated by the women's organizations.
J'ai publié un livre, Le ventre pourri de la bête,
And I published a book called Le ventre pourri de la bête, The Rotten Belly of the Beast.
parce que, en dépit de mon expérience, lors de mon passage au CEP, j'ai découvert des réalités inattendues à l'entière.
And I based
Hors
this
du
book
commun, tout à fait.
in my experience because when I got into this organization, the CEP, I found things that were not expected and that were really out of the ordinary.
Mais ces faits qui sont très étonnants, très frappants,
But these facts, very surprising,
n'ont pas été relatés seulement à l'intérieur du CEP, mais dans la société haïtienne en général et touchent également l'implication de la communauté internationale.
so these were not just happening in the midst of the CEP, but also in the community and also touched the international community.
Donc le ventre pourri ne désigne pas ce qui se passe au CEP, mais ce qui se passe dans le contexte avec tous les acteurs, y compris l'international.
So the belly that we're talking about is not just what happens within the CEP, but what happens in the whole context, including the international community's involvement.
Alors, le premier problème que j'ai relaté, c'est le non-respect de la périodicité constitutionnelle pour les élections.
One of the things that I talk about in my book is the lack of respect for the timeliness of the work within the givens of the Constitution.
Alex vient de dire que les constitutions qui se font actuellement auraient dû se faire il y a 3 ans.
You know, Alex already said that the Constitution, the elections that were done, should have happened 3 years ago.
Et ce renvoi des élections,
And the fact that these elections were postponed
oui, ça se relève récurrent, ça se répète à chaque fois.
has been happening again and again.
Et nous pensons qu'en dehors des codes structurels, il y a aussi le facteur politique qui rentre en jeu.
We think that there
Excuse-moi, des intérêts politiques.
are political interests that are also involved in making this happen.
Et ceux qui sont au pouvoir veulent rester au pouvoir.
Those in power want to stay in power.
Nous n'avons pas la tradition d'alternance politique.
We don't have the tradition of alternating in our politics.
Donc, la conclusion est que ce renvoi de la périodicité cache cette réalité-là.
So our conclusion is this hesitation or this postponing of the terms brings about this problem.
Maintenant, je voudrais signaler quelques paradoxes qui existent dans le contexte général des élections.
Let me mention some of the paradoxes that exist in this situation with the elections.
Ces paradoxes ont été identifiés par Suzy Castor, qui est une historienne.
These have been identified by C.B. Castor, who is a historian.
Mais moi, je vais illustrer avec mon vécu au sein du CEP.
And I would like to illustrate these using my own experiences in the midst of the CEP.
L'un des premiers paradoxes, c'est qu'on a un État faible, mais le gouvernement est omniprésent.
One of these paradoxes is that we have a weak state, but the government is omnipresent.
Donc, l'État et les institutions sont en pleine déliquescence.
Okay, the states and institutions are falling apart.
Et par contre, l'exécutif et les pouvoirs, l'exécutif et les élus, ils sont très impliqués.
But the president and the people who are elected, the elected officials, are very implicated, very present.
Pendant mon passage au CEP, je n'ai pas relaté d'injonction du président de la République au Conseil électoral.
When I was in the CEP, I did not relate an injunction from the president to the work of the Electoral Commission.
Mais la présidence possède un ensemble de leviers qui peuvent forcer le CEP à agir dans un sens ou dans un autre.
But the president has a certain number of levers or pressure points to influence the work of the CEP.
Par exemple, le déblocage des fonds peut prendre du temps, selon que l'action qui va se poser est dans l'intérêt ou non du président.
So, for example, releasing the monies that are needed could take time depending on whether the presidency is in favor or not of the action that the CEP wants to take.
Le nombre de postes à pourvoir, et à cause du décalage des élections, il arrive que les postes se superposent. Je ne sais pas si vous comprenez. C'est-à-dire que si on devait faire seulement les élections législatives, il peut arriver que les élections législatives et les élections municipales se retrouvent ensemble à cause du décalage.
Because of the different delays, sometimes it happens that the different levels of government have their elections coinciding or coming one on top of the other. For example, the municipal election time period can come at the same time as the national representatives.
C'est un autre levier pour le chef d'État, pour l'exécutif. Parce qu'il peut dire, selon ses intérêts, il n'a pas les moyens de faire toutes les élections en même temps, il peut décider de faire seulement une élection.
But this is another way that the government uses its leverage to bring power into the situation, to say there's not enough means or not enough resources to do both elections at the same time.
Nous allons à un deuxième paradoxe.
Let's look at a second paradox.
La société est fragilisée, mais les élections sont coûteuses.
The society is very fragile, but the elections cost a lot of money.
Et de 4 millions de dollars tirés des fonds publics en 1990 à 8
Of the
millions.
$400 million taken out of the public funds in 1990,
À 8 millions en 1995,
8 million in 95,
29 millions en 2010.
29 million in 2010,
Et en 2014, les premières estimations allaient jusqu'à 34,6 millions.
and in the estimation that we have for 2014 is 34,000 million.
Les données accusent de 40 dollars par électeur haïtien, 40 dollars US par électeur haïtien, en comparaison avec le Brésil qui est à 2 dollars.
The cost of election has been calculated at $40 for each voter, In comparison with Brazil, where it costs $2 to run the elections per voter.
Ce qui est tout à fait aberrant dans le pays le plus pauvre de l'hémisphère.
This is apparent in the country that is the poorest one in the Western Hemisphere.
Mon témoignage,
My testimony
c'est que il y a toujours une explication à tout.
There's always an explanation for everything.
Et pour le cas des élections, le prix des élections,
For the price of the elections,
les raisons c'était qu'il faut moderniser,
the explanation was, well, we need to modernize
de manière à assurer une plus grande rigueur
so that there is a greater rigor
et de rapidité également,
and speed
et d'autres raisons.
and other reasons.
Je pense que la morale de l'histoire,
The
c'est
moral of the story
oui, c'est qu'il y a un débat et un choix judicieux ne peut découler que de la considération des enjeux et le rapport aux objectifs bénéfiques pour le pays et le plus grand nombre.
so that
Oui. C'est qu'il faut choisir
we have to choose between
en fonction des enjeux
the different factors
oui, et le rapport
and the relationship between
au bénéfice du pays, du plus grand nombre.
the greater benefit to the country
Et pour garantir le triomphe du vote populaire.
and to guarantee the victory of the popular vote.
Et ce deuxième paradoxe qui réfère au cours des élections
The second paradox in the course of these elections
amène à un autre corollaire.
comes to another corollary.
Les élections nationales et la tutelle internationale.
The national elections et la
La tutelle, comme on le dit.
tutelage, international tutelage.
Et l'écrivain Jean-André Victor fait allusion au régime électoral de tutelle, avec 4 facteurs clés.
So we already talked about 4 key factors of electoral tutelage.
Et le financement,
Finance,
le recours à l'expertise internationale,
the access to international expertise,
l'arbitrage international,
international arbitration,
qui permet aux meneurs de jeu d'atteindre leur objectif.
which allows those who are running the game to get to to meet their objectives.
Alors, mon témoignage,
My testimony is this.
le financement des élections en 2010 avait atteint, le financement des élections par l'international avait atteint une proportion d'environ 80%.
The financing in 2010 of the election was up to at least 8%.
L'expertise internationale est apportée depuis 2005 et continue à être présente. L'expertise internationale,
International expertise
oui, qu'on a eu depuis 2005,
that we've had since 2005 is still there today.
elle est toujours là. La question, c'est à quand le transfert des connaissances?
And when will there be a transfer of this knowledge?
Pendant les élections de novembre 2010,
In the election 2010,
il y a eu l'intervention du groupe des 12
there was an intervention by the group of 12
qui avait demandé d'arrêter les élections.
who asked that the elections be stopped
Dans la journée même du scrutin.
in the very day that they were to be happening.
En dépit des justifications,
But in spite of these justifications,
on sent qu'il y a eu une manipulation de l'international.
we felt that there was manipulation from the international parties.
De même,
And so
le communiqué de l'ambassade américaine du 4 novembre, après la proclamation des résultats préliminaires,
the declaration that came out of the U.S. Embassy on the 4th of November after the announcement of the results,
et qui dénonçait les fraudes de ces élections,
denouncing the fraud of this election,
s'est accompagné de manifestations de rue immédiates.
there were immediate demonstrations in the street.
Donc il y avait une relation, encore une influence de l'international.
I believe there was a relationship between those two things and an influence that came from the international powers.
Mais ce qui a été plus crucial,
What was more crucial,
ce sont les interventions du représentant du secrétaire général de l'ONU, M. Edmond Muller,
what were the interventions of the Secretary of the United Nations, Edmond Muller.
The OAS. It was the MINUSTA.
Les Nations Unies, c'était le...
That's the MINUSTA.
Oui, c'est le représentant du secrétaire général des Nations Unies en Haïti.
The representative of the Secretary of the United Nations in the forces in Haiti.
Il coiffe aussi la MINUSTA.
And that person is also in charge of MINUSTA.
Je disais qu'il y avait les deux cas les plus cruciaux, c'est l'intervention de M. Muller et celle des enquêteurs de
The two factors that were very important was the intervention of Mr. Muller and the intervention of the people from the Organization of American States.
Je cite ces deux parce que nous parlons des élections de 2010.
I want to cite these two because we're talking about the elections that happened in 2010.
Mais je voudrais quand même signaler qu'en 2009,
But I also wanted to say that in 2009,
je voulais aussi signaler l'intervention de Jeannette Sanderson, l'ambassadrice des États-Unis.
I wanted to also speak about the intervention of Jeannette Sanderson from the United States to
Des États-Unis, from here,
Jeannette Sanderson
from the United States. Cette intervention exigeait carrément
So in her intervention, she was requiring, actually,
que le groupe Lavalas,
that the group,
la famille Lavalas, le parti,
the party called the Famille Lavalas,
soit accepté
should be accepted
pour participer aux élections,
to participate in the elections,
alors que les conditions n'étaient pas remplies
even though the conditions had not been met
par ce parti.
by that party.
On rentrera dans les détails après.
And we'll talk more about that in a minute.
Mais en 2010, revenons à 2010,
So going back to 2010,
Edmond Muller a encore été plus arrogant que Jeannette Sanderson.
Mr. Edmond Muller was even more arrogant than Jeannette Sanderson.
Et dans une conversation qui est relatée dans ce livre,
And in a conversation that is related in this book,
il a explicitement dit
he said explicitly
que la communauté internationale
that the international community
ne voulait pas de Jude Célestin.
did not want Jude Celestin.
Jude Célestin était présenté par le parti Unité,
Jude Celestin was presented by the Unity Party,
proche du président Préval,
which was very close to President Préval,
et qui est perçu comme en filiation directe avec Lavalas.
and which is perceived to be in direct connection with Lavalas.
Le message d'Edmond Muller
The message of Edmond Muller
disait ceci:
said this:
on ne veut pas de Jude Célestin, même pour participer au deuxième tour, voire qu'il réussisse au premier tour.
So we're not going to take away Jude Celestin. No,
We don't want
we don't want
Jude
to take
Célestin,
Jude Celestin,
even to participate in the second
even
round,
to allow him to go into the second round of the elections.
voire pour réussir au premier tour.
Even if he is successful in the first round.
They don't want him to go to the second round, and evidently he can win in the first round.
Yeah, even though he might have been able to win in the
I don't
first
know
round.
if you understand what I mean. Donc il avait dit ça très clairement.
And he said that very clearly.
Et ce n'était pas un mot en l'air.
And that was not said lightly.
Parce que après, quand la commission d'enquête de l'OEA
So because later when there was a commission of investigation for the OEA,
en fait, Jude Célestin était mis out.
and so at that point, Jude Celestin was put out.
And Michel Martelly went at the second place.
And Mr. Martelly was put into second.
Before OAS come, the two first, like Alex said, the two first candidates was Yolande Maniga and Jude Celestin. And then when Muller asked what we just said, came the commission d'enquête de l'OEA, and finally, Jude Celestin was out, and the two first persons that supposed to go to the second one were Yolande Maniga and Michel Martelly. Alors, ce que je voulais dire,
What I wanted to say then
c'est que les membres du CEP,
the members of the CEP,
ils ne se sont même pas donné la peine de vérifier les résultats de la commission d'enquête de l'ONU.
they didn't even bother to verify the results of the study that was done by the OEA.
Peut-être que Michel Martelly aurait réussi, normalement.
Maybe
Aucun
Michel
rien ne le
Martelly
prouve.
would have been the winner.
Rien ne le prouve. Et
Nothing to prove that it wasn't the case.
ce qui a retenu, c'est qu'il a été projeté en deuxième phase.
But those results were put forward.
Alors, je dois dire que pendant tout ce temps, j'ai eu des prises de position pour dire tout ce que je viens de dire là. On n'en a pas pris compte et finalement, j'ai démissionné.
And I need to say that while this was all happening, I was raising my voice several times to say the things that I'm already telling you now, and I was not listened to, and finally I resigned.
Et je n'ai pas signé les résultats
And I did
de
not
Michel
sign
Martelly de 2010.
the results for Michel Martelly of 2010.
Je crois que je dois m'arrêter.
Oui.
Time for me to stop?
Okay, yeah, thank you, Jeannette. I just want to emphasize that Jeannette was a very independent voice in the CP, and that was what was interesting. She often didn't sign on to the CP's resolutions, and then she would put out press releases explaining her position. She talked just now about the fact that she believes that the conditions had not been met by Lavalas early in 2009 to be on the ballot. But then later in 2009, she believed they had been, and she dissented against the rest of the CEP members and even put out a press release again saying that there was no justification for not including the party Famille Lavalas on the ballot. Just to show you that she really doesn't seem to have any sort of partisan connections, and I think that's something fairly unique from a member of the CEP. But we're going to move on now to Haiti's most well-known human rights lawyer, Mario Joseph, who since 1996 has led the Bureau des Avocats Internationaux, the Office of International Lawyers in Port-au-Prince, which represents political prisoners, poor people, and victims of political violence. He's very well known for his role in prosecuting, in succeeding in having prosecutions against those responsible for a massacre that took place in 1994, the Raboteau massacre. And in 2006, the New York Times acknowledged that Joseph is Haiti's most prominent human rights lawyer. In 2012, Mario and IJDH director Brian Concanon, who sits just to the left of Mario, filed a suit against the United Nations on behalf of the victims of the 2010 Haiti cholera outbreak, which was introduced by the MINUSTA troops in October of 2010. And there will be another panel about that, of course, later on. I just want people to know, since everything is now off schedule, what the new schedule for the panels is. The next panel will start at 12:30. Then there'll be briefly lunch at 1:40, and then at 2 we'll have the third panel, which I believe is the cholera panel, until 3:10. So sorry about the delay and everything. It's kind of beyond our control. And now I'd like Mario to take the stand. Thank you very much, Mario.
You're welcome. Bonjour. Good morning. I would like to thank the Haiti Advocacy Working Group for organizing this panel and for inviting me to participate on it. I would like to thank all of you for coming and look forward to our discussions about politics and elections in Haiti. In light of the conference term, Haiti for whom? I think it is worth posing the questions. Election for whom? At this panel, that is a good question. We hear a lot from the perspective of Haitian government, the international community, and the political parties. But we need to keep in mind that the most important perspective in any voting is the voters. The voters want three things. They want to vote freely. They want to choose freely from all eligible candidates. And they want to vote, their vote counted. Voters have a right to those three things. A right recognized by Haitians and international law. The right is protected by a series of rules in Haiti's constitutions and our laws. I would like to address three groups of rules that are particularly important for the next elections. Rules on timing of the elections, rules on whom runs them, and a rule on who gets to be candidates. This whole political crisis has been generated by failure to respect the timing of elections. Regular elections in Haiti are clearly set out in our constitutions, as in the U.S. constitutions, but those rules have been ignored. All our mayors are appointed, and 1/3 of our Senate seats are vacant. 2/3 of our Senate, or the whole Senate, vacant because the election that the Constitution scheduled for 2011 have not yet happened. Then we lost another third of our Senate and all of the House of Deputies when election did not happen last fall. This situation is obviously a serious violation of the right of vote. The second important group of rules is who gets to run the elections. That has been the center of the political crisis the last 2 years. The real solutions, according to the Constitution, is a permanent electoral council. As Mrs. Cherubin said, a permanent council has never been formed in the nearly 30 years of our constitutions. So the current administrations inherit the problem, but President Lamothe missed the opportunity to have elections that could create a permanent council by proposing a series of electoral councils that fell short of constitutional requirements in a very important ways. The current council is the least unconstitutional and the least controversial of the series, but it still raises important concern, particularly about whether voters will be allowed to choose from all eligible candidates and whether their vote will be counted. The third group of rule is who gets to be candidates. The Electoral Council and the government have been saying the right things about allowing all parties to participate, as has the U.S. government. But a lot of those right things were said before Senate elections in 2009 and presidential and parliamentary elections in 2010, which systematically and illegally exclude candidates from Formula Ballas and other parties. In fact, members of the U.S. Congress, both Democrats and Republicans, Rand Secretary of State Clinton, that proceeding with the exclusive elections will lead exactly the political crisis we now have. Another issue that is important to raise here in Washington is the issue of election financing. It has become a tradition in Haiti that most of the elections financing has become from the international community, especially the U.S. While we appreciate the irregularities, Haiti have the same concern about foreign funding of elections that Americans will have. Voting is an exercise of national sovereignty and should be paid for with sovereign funds. Some would argue that international financing provides the international community leverage to advocate for better elections. I am afraid the international community actually practice, especially the generous financial and diplomatic support for the predictable disasters in 2010 elections, does not support that argument. It is also important to discuss, especially here in Washington, some legal issues that form the elections. The peacekeeping missions minister violated Haitian constitutional and international law, and no one has yet articulated how it complies with the UN Charter requirement that it is addressing with threat to international peace. A lot of international communities' intervention in Haiti, especially the interim Haitian reconstruction commissions, were clearly illegal under our law, regardless of their political justifications. President Mateli has organized 7 carnivals. He already planned to organize the 8th in July, but 0 elections under the eyes of the international community, including United States. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mario. And we'll move right along next to Nixon Bumba, who is a consultant for the American Jewish World Service in Haiti, has been since July 2012, but probably best known as a Haiti social movement leader, very involved in the student movement a number of years ago and in the popular movement for democracy, Modep. So Bumba articulates with Haitian grassroots groups and works together on common goals regarding the economic, social, and cultural rights for Haitians, and on the fight against land grabbing and mining. So Bumba is going to give us some of that grassroots perspective today on the current political situation.
Merci Alex, et merci à... Merci Alex, merci à chacun des membres du org pour m'avoir invité dans ce panel assez important.
Thank you to all the members of HOG who invited me to this important panel.
Et dans la mesure où la question des élections ou la question de la situation politique, je sais que ça a été une casse-tête pour le org, et chaque fois on se pose la question, qu'est-ce qui se passe en Haïti?
And I know that this whole question of the politics and the elections in Haiti has been like a great puzzle, and people in the HOG have been trying to understand.
Et je suis très heureux d'être de ce panel, et surtout pour répondre à cette question que
very...
Mario, et bien sûr, a déjà porté sur la table. Élection pour quoi? Élection pour qui?
And I'm very happy to be part of this panel to talk about the questions that Mario has already raised. Elections for what, for whom?
Yeah. Je veux rappeler seulement quelques éléments et puis faire quelques constats.
I would like to remind us of several elements and then make several observations.
Et attirer l'attention du public sur les enjeux des prochaines élections en Haïti.
And give my audience some of my thoughts about the next elections in Haiti.
Et finir avec certaines recommandations.
And come then to some recommendations.
Je vais essayer d'être bref comme Alex vient de le même.
I also will try to be brief as Alex recommended.
Donc depuis la Constitution de 1987,
Since the Constitution of 1987,
qui a été un des plus grands acquis en termes d'avancée démocratique en Haïti,
one of the greatest acquisitions in terms of advance in democracy in Haiti,
aucun des préalables exigés par la Constitution pour faire fonctionner la démocratie n'a été mis en place.
none prior to that, none of the other things that had been in place to require democracy in Haiti had been put into place.
Jeannette et Mario viennent de souligner, donc un conseil électoral permanent,
The things that Ginette and Mario also said, to have a permanent electoral council.
qui aurait dû être les résultats du processus de la base, donc la démocratie dans sa base, qui pourrait élire les membres du conseil électoral permanent.
It should have happened that people from the base of our society should have been able to elect members of the electoral council.
Depuis le départ de la dictature, on n'a pas connu vraiment de parti politique avec de projets capables de conduire le peuple dans les sièges, par exemple, quand le peuple va aux élections pour voter, pour choisir. Donc, la question des partis politiques, c'est une question extrêmement importante dans la démocratie.
Since the fall of the dictatorship, there has not really been the opportunity for political parties to develop that could bring the voice of the people into the government of Haiti.
Et on va assister surtout à un processus de clientélisation où les partis, c'est des personnes, des groupuscules, mais qui vont essayer d'instrumentaliser une partie de la population dans des sièges, mais pas dans des projets exactement.
So what we see happening is more of like a clientization where the political parties have people who are loyal to them, but they don't really bring people into creating their own policy or proposals for the future of the country.
Le deuxième constat que je partage avec vous, c'est la question de la participation des citoyens.
The second question that I want to raise with you is that of the participation of citizens.
Mario et Ginette l'a souligné un peu. Depuis la première et la seule vraie élection qui a eu lieu dans le pays en 1990,
Since the one and only free election that happened in the country in 1990,
on a constaté une diminution drastique dans la participation des gens aux élections.
we have seen a drastic diminishing of participation of the population in elections.
Or, les élections supposaient être un processus d'exercice de souveraineté populaire où le peuple choisit qui doit diriger et qui doit conduire le pays.
But in spite of the fact that elections are supposed to be a sovereign and popular exercise in which the people of the country choose who they want to have in their government.
Depuis 1990, il n'y a que seulement en 2006 où on a eu une élection où 30% des personnes ont été votées.
Instead, we've had an election in 2006 where only 30% of the people voted.
Et en même temps, on regarde le processus en 3 dimensions.
So we have a process instead where there are 3 dimensions.
C'est un processus de gangstérisation des élections.
First of all, it's a process of which the elections are gangsterized.
Où on va, par exemple, on va avoir des parlements. C'est les gens qui font la loi dans les parlements, c'est des gens qui ont affaire avec la justice, par exemple.
So the people who are in the parliament are people who are actually in justice, in criminal cases.
Et un processus de marchandisation des élections.
And they're in a process of marchandisation. I'm sorry. Selling out village.
Donc on est en plein cas aujourd'hui, les scandales ont éclaté de l'autre côté de l'île, en République dominicaine, où les élections ont été monnayées et vendues par ceux qui sont au pouvoir, ont été grâce à des financements de fonds provenant d'une certaine mafia en République dominicaine. Aujourd'hui, tout le problème est en train de se poser actuellement en Haïti.
Recently, we saw the case in the Dominican Republic where the elections were sold out to people, and now we see this same kind of trend coming into Haiti.
Et en troisième dimension du processus, c'est la mémise de l'international. Certains appellent un processus de colonisation de l'appareil électoral.
And now the third element that we see coming in is the heavy hand of the international community that's colonizing the electoral process.
Où de plus en plus on va avoir des dirigeants qui répondent aux déshydratats de la communauté internationale et des partenaires internationaux, mais non au peuple qui les a élus.
And so there we see these political parties and these powers responding more to the international influence of the international powers and not to the voice of the Haitian public.
Moi-même et un ami, on a fait ce constat un peu systématiquement.
My friend and I have made this observation very systematically.
Jusqu'à la troisième année du mandat de Martelly.
Just until now, the third year of the mandate of Martelly.
Où vous allez suivre, contrairement à Prévaler à Aristide, les débuts de mandat, c'est toujours on remercie et tout ce qu'on va faire, on va le faire pour non seulement les partenaires internationaux.
So what we saw en gouvernement 2.
Martelly. Donc, le gouvernement ou le président de la République, quand il ne s'adresse plus à la nation,
He
il
doesn't
s'adresse
address himself when he speaks, the president, to the nation, but he's addressing himself to
des partenaires internationaux,
international partners,
les agences internationales,
international agencies,
nos amis, les amis d'Haïti,
the friends of Haiti,
où le peuple, la société haïtienne devient le cadet des soucis de ceux qui dirigent le pays.
and the actual welfare of the country, of the Haitians, becomes the last of their concerns.
Pour revenir à la question de la participation aux élections,
Coming back to the question of participation in elections,
depuis après les élections de 90,
since after the election of 1990,
on a des gouvernements ou des dirigeants qui jouissent d'un déficit de légitimité.
we have a government where those in power do not benefit from legitimacy, or they have a lack of legitimacy.
Pour certains, ils ont été délégitimés par l'international même.
And some have been delegitimized by international forces.
Et pour d'autres, c'est qu'il n'y a pas vraiment une participation de la population à choisir ses représentants.
And in many other cases, there was no actual participation of the population in choosing those representatives.
Et ça renforce de plus en plus un écart entre la société, la nation, avec ce qui supposait être son État ou son gouvernement.
And so that leads us to a situation of a huge gap between the population, the nation, and its state, its government.
Yeah. Alors pour arriver sur les enjeux, jusqu'avant de faire les recommandations, parce qu'Alex m'a
So
dit de
let's
parler.
come to some of the questions.
Et plein de gens, et parmi nous, des personnes de bonne volonté qui travaillent au orgue avec beaucoup de solidarité sur Haïti.
Many of people like yourselves here, people who are in solidarity, who work in organizations like HOG,
On est tombé dans ce discours qu'il n'y a pas eu d'élection dans le pays depuis 2010.
are talking about this situation where there have not been elections in the country since 2010.
Or, depuis 2006, il n'y a pas eu d'élection pour les pouvoirs fondamentaux dans l'exercice de la démocratie, qui sont les collectivités territoriales, par exemple.
So since 2006, there have not been elections for some of the most foundational of the institutions within our country, as for example, the
Les collectivités territoriales, les autorités locales,
the local collectives.
qui supposaient être l'espace de participation et d'exercice citoyen de la démocratie.
Those are supposed to be the places where the local population will exercise its democracy.
Mais ça n'a jamais attiré l'attention des personnes. Et le président a nommé ses amis pour devenir agents exécutifs intérimaires, des casernes intérimaires. Donc ça n'a jamais vraiment attiré l'attention des gens.
But that never seems to come to the attention of people, and the president took advantage of that situation to name friends and other people into local government.
Yeah. Actuellement, on en parle et tout le monde est censé, on dit qu'on a un ouf puisque le processus est en marche, on va avoir des élections.
So now we're in a situation where people are saying, "Ooh, finally we're going to have elections."
Et il y a deux scénarios en phase maintenant sur les élections.
So there are two scenarios here that we're looking at in terms of this election.
Un des scénarios, ça a été un souhait. N'a pas été un souhait, ça a été presque un dictat imposé par l'ambassadrice américaine en Haïti, Pamela White.
One is sort of like a wish or a hope that was pretty much imposed by the ambassadors from the United States in Haiti, Pamela White.
Quand elle dit en fin de 2013 que nous n'avons pas d'argent pour financer plusieurs élections en Haïti, donc il faut qu'il y ait une seule élection.
She said we don't have enough money to finance several elections in Haiti, so there has to be just one election.
Et maintenant on est presque sûr qu'on va avoir une seule élection dans le pays.
And so now we're pretty sure that we're only going to have just one election in the country.
Et deux choses qu'ils veulent régler avec cette question des élections.
And two things that they want to try to straighten out with this election.
D'abord, le pouvoir de Martelly l'a démontré très clair, c'est une peur ou une haine du Parlement comme fonction, comme co-dépositaire du pouvoir et de la souveraineté en Haïti.
First thing is one that President Martelly talked about, and it is hatred and a lack of trust of the people in the parliament.
Et deuxième, c'est qu'ils veulent réduire le nombre des élections.
And secondly, reduce the number of elections.
Parce qu'ils disent que les élections sont trop coûteuses.
And because they say that elections cost too much money.
Alors que les élections, comme Jeannette vient de le démontrer, n'ont jamais été aussi coûteuses que lorsque l'international voulait mettre beaucoup d'argent.
But as Jeannette has told us very clearly, the elections have never been so expensive as they were since the international community has tried to get involved in
Ils se
Russia.
servent des élections pour légitimer leur présence dans les affaires du pays, de leur immixtion dans les affaires du pays.
So they use elections in order to legitimize their presence and their activity intervening in the country.
Je regrette qu'on ne peut pas vraiment analyser cette question des élections, parce que vraiment c'est très important. Si on veut avoir des informations sur les élections, ça c'est autre chose. Mais si on veut comprendre ce qui se passe, il faut vraiment analyser les mécanismes mis en place pour qu'on ait des élections et un type de gouvernement et d'État comme ce qu'on a maintenant.
I wish that we had more time to really go into this question, because it's important to understand what is going on in the question of these failed elections.
Je demande à Alex 2 minutes seulement
I'm asking Alex now
pour
for 2
dresser le tableau
minutes.
de le deuxième scénario.
I want to talk about the second scenario.
Le deuxième scénario, c'est le scénario où cette année, il ne va pas avoir des élections.
So the second scenario is that maybe won't be these elections.
Donc là, il y a 3 documents que je vous réfère peut-être. J'ai passé ces documents à Alex, sans doute à les a lus.
I have given 3 documents here to Alex. He's maybe already read them.
Pour ces 3 documents, un c'est un discours de l'ambassadrice Pamela White dans un dîner en décembre.
There was one, that's a speech that was given by the ambassador Pamela White in December.
L'autre, c'est des recommandations de ce qu'ils appellent un corps groupe, le corps groupe qui réunissent les ambassadeurs et les grandes agences internationales dans la ministère.
Is another recommendation that comes from what they call the core group of different ambassadors that they bring together.
Et en autre, c'est la chambre de commerce, non, le secteur privé, le forum du secteur privé qui a commandité.
And the third one is from the forum of the private sector.
Et ces trois documents, et c'est pas des moyens, ils accusent la Constitution comme obstacle, comme barrière, comme obstacle au développement du pays et à la croissance économique.
And these 3 are accusing the Constitution of being an obstacle to the development of democracy in the country.
En sous-bassement de ces documents, ce n'est pas des élections qu'il faut avoir. Si on doit avoir des élections, qu'il faut que ce gouvernement contrôle tout l'appareil, est capable de falsifier ou de modifier la Constitution à leur guise, ou bien qu'il n'y a pas d'élection, on a une transition qui durerait entre 36 et 38 mois.
So maybe instead of having the election, there should be some kind of a transition that would take from up to 36 months.
Et une des premières décisions, c'est de créer un conseil consultatif pour édicter une nouvelle constitution capable d'éliminer, par exemple, le nombre des élections, le pouvoir du Parlement, et les exigences de reddition de comptes de l'exécutif, par exemple.
And to use this interim to reformulate the Constitution, to get rid of certain provisions, to reduce the number of elections.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. And I hate to be putting pressure on our Haitian friends, since the U.S. seems to do that every day, and I'm just contributing to the problem. But we do have a real time limit, and I want to give Brian at least 5 minutes to speak. I think Brian can maybe speak quickly since his English is very fluent, so we don't need translation on this. So Brian is a human rights lawyer and activist and directs the Boston-based Institute for Justice and Democracy in Haiti, which helps Haitians enforce the human rights they need to escape poverty and vulnerability. Anyway, Brian.
Thank Thanks, Alex, and thanks everybody for coming. Thanks to Hog. In particular, I'd like to really thank the other panelists. I found it a really fascinating discussion, and I have nothing to add to what's already been said in terms of what's going on in Haiti. But I'd like to briefly make 2 points of particular concern to people in the United States. One is why we should care about all of this, and the second point is how we should care about all of this. In terms of why we should care, I mean, the most obvious reasons are the reasons that we've already heard. You know, this is critical to the development of democracy in Haiti. It's critical to the daily lives of 10 million people who are already suffering enough. But I think in a more self-interested way, it's important too. A lot of us are involved in trying to make systems work in Haiti, our own working for justice system. But we, along with many other people, especially within the HOG group, are also supporting groups that are trying to do policy advocacy in Haiti. And we found it very difficult over the last 4 years. And I think I think the solidarity community as a whole in the United States has done a poor job of rising to the challenges of Haiti's election and more importantly, the implications of our government in support of poor elections. I think, from my own organization's perspective, it's always been a challenge because we don't have an election rights program, we don't have financing for it, we don't have dedicated personnel. I know a lot of other organizations are very wary of entangling in partisan politics. And so there's lots of reasons why we don't get engaged as much as we should in Haiti elections rights work. But we do need to understand that there are severe consequences to poor elections, and it's ones that we see every day. And I think, as Jeannette described, we basically have a government chosen by the international community in spite of Haitian voters and in spite of Haitian rules. Then it shouldn't be a surprise that, as Nixon described, that's a government that's responsive to the international community and not to Haitian voters and laws. And so we really need to take a choice, make our choices as to which side we're on that. In terms of how we should care, I think we really have a great opportunity to build on what was done before in 2010. I think we didn't do as good a job as we could have in 2010. But I think it was not negligible. And kind of a good start for what happened in 2010 is this purple handout that's out on the table. It's called Haiti's Flawed Elections, They Told Us So, which was written in November 2010 as a lot of the things that Jeannette was talking about were happening, and basically explaining why this was a very well-predicted disaster. I'd encourage people to read this. I'd also encourage people to read, I think it's also out, it is out there, CEPR's handout explaining some of the details of what Jeannette described as to how those elections were, in fact, election results were manipulated. I think we can build on that kind of work, and I think we have some unique opportunities that we didn't have in 2010 because of technology, both communications technology, but also ways of doing crowdsourcing, and just the fact that we developed some skills in the solidarity community in 2009 and 2010 that I think we can build on. In terms of what's happening in HOG has an elections working group, and obviously anybody else in HOG, we encourage joining onto that. People who aren't involved in HOG, there's lots of ways of getting involved. I know IJDH, one of the things I'm most excited about is at IJDH we have a very strong involvement. We still don't have any financing or staff for it, but we actually have a good group of volunteers. We're still looking for more people who want to work on election issues. I don't know if CEPR, you're taking volunteers, but you can say if that's true. In any other organizations in HOG that are looking for volunteers in election work, please speak up. And I think that we understand what the problems are because it's probably going to repeat itself in 2010. And we do have a unique opportunity to support the great work going on in Haiti, which is also better than it was in 2010 in terms of advocacy, and to try to find ways of getting the fight in Haiti up to Washington and the general public to really make a difference in Haiti.
Okay, thanks. Short and sweet. Thank you, Brian. So yes, just to answer your question, CEPR is interested in any contributions from outside, and will definitely be more engaged on the elections as soon as we have an idea of when they're going to happen. and how they're going to unfold, and whether we're going to want to see whether they're really going to be transparent and inclusive this time around, and what the role of the international community will be. So we have just 5 minutes to take 2 or 3 questions. I'd like for the panelists at the same time to sort of give very quick concluding remarks, where maybe they can also include any final recommendations, really, I think, directed at the U.S., the U.S. Congress, the U.S. government, what can be done from the U.S. to try to ensure that the next set of elections aren't as bad as the last elections, and that we can have a really legitimate government with a strong popular mandate this next time around. Okay, Bert, first question.